In the gentle darkness of a summer night in 1547, when the world moved at the pace of footsteps and the turning of seasons, there existed a small walled garden behind a monastery in the hills of Tuscany. The air was soft and still, carrying the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine and the earthy scent of recently watered soil. Moonlight filtered through the leaves of an ancient fig tree, casting shifting patterns of silver and shadow across neat rows of herbs that had been tended with the same care for generations. Brother Marco moved slowly along the gravel paths, his sandaled feet making the softest whisper against the small stones. In his weathered hands, he carried a simple clay lamp, its flame steady and warm in the protective glass. The light danced gently across his lined face, illuminating eyes that had seen 60 summers come and go, each one teaching him something new about the patient art of growing things. The garden was perhaps 40 paces long and 30 wide, enclosed by walls of honey-colored stone that still held the day's warmth. These walls had stood for nearly 2 centuries, built by hands that understood how stone should meet stone, how mortar should settle, how a wall should breathe with the seasons. Climbing roses traced their way up the southern wall, their petals closed now in sleep, waiting for tomorrow's sun. Brother Marco paused beside a patch of lavender, its purple spikes releasing their perfume into the night air with each gentle breath of wind. He bent slowly, his knees creaking with the familiar ache of age, and pinched a few sprigs between his fingers. The scent rose immediately, sharp and clean and deeply calming. This lavender would dry in neat bundles hanging from the rafters of his workroom, ready to soothe the troubled sleep of villagers who climbed the winding path to the monastery seeking relief from life's persistent worries. The lamp's glow revealed row upon row of carefully tended plants. Rosemary grew in sturdy bushes, their needle-like leaves dark green in the night. Sage spread its soft, gray-green leaves in generous patches, while thyme crept along the edges of the paths in fragrant mats. Each plant had its place, its purpose, its season of harvest. Each had been planted by hands that understood the deep patience required to coax healing from the earth. A night bird called softly from somewhere beyond the walls, perhaps an owl beginning its hunt, or a nightingale settling into song. The sound seemed to belong to the garden as naturally as the rustle of leaves or the distant whisper of a stream that wound its way through the valley below. All was peace here, a peace so complete it seemed to rise from the very soil and wrap itself around anyone who entered this sanctuary. Brother Marco straightened slowly, his back protesting gently. He had been the keeper of this garden for nearly 30 years, learning first from Brother Antonio, who had learned from Brother Giuseppe before him. The knowledge passed from hand to hand, season to season, like water flowing continuously from a hidden spring. Tonight, as on so many nights before, he would walk these familiar paths, checking for signs of drought or pest, harvesting what needed harvesting, simply being present with the growing things that had become his life's work. The monastery bell tower stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its stones pale in the moonlight. Soon, the bell would sound the call to Compline, the final prayer of the day, but for now there was time for this quiet communion with the garden. Time to breathe in the mingled scents of 100 different herbs, to feel the soft night air against his face, to listen to the gentle symphony of growing things settling into sleep. This was the hour when the garden revealed its deepest secrets, when the day's heat released the essential oils locked within countless leaves and flowers, when the air itself became a healing balm. Brother Marco had learned to love these night walks not just for the practical work they allowed, the harvesting of herbs that gave up their potency most readily in the cool hours, but for the deep peace they brought to his soul. The flame in his lamp flickered slightly as a breath of wind found its way over the wall, carrying with it the distant scent of olive groves and the faint salt tang of the sea, still many miles away but somehow present in the night air. All of Tuscany seemed to breathe around this small, enclosed world, this garden that had become a repository of ancient wisdom and gentle care. The monastery of San Michele stood on a hill that caught the first light of dawn and held the last glow of sunset, positioned as if the original builders had understood something essential about the rhythm of days and seasons. Founded in the year 1287 by a small group of Benedictine monks seeking solitude and simplicity, it had grown slowly over the centuries into a place of quiet learning and healing. The brothers who lived here followed the ancient rule of Saint Benedict: to pray and to work, ora et labora, finding God in both contemplation and in the daily tasks that sustained life. Brother Marco had come to this place as a young man of 28, his hands already skilled in the growing of things. He had been born in a village in the valley. Below, the son of a man who grew herbs and vegetables behind a small stone house where the morning glory climbed the walls and chickens scratched in the dirt beneath fruit trees heavy with pears and plums. His father had taught him the first lessons, how to read the sky for rain, how to feel the soil between his fingers, to know when it was ready for seed, how to watch the plants themselves for signs of health or distress. But it was here, within these monastery walls, that Marco had learned the deeper mysteries of the herbal arts. Brother Antonio had been ancient even then, his hair white as the flowers of the elder bush, his movement slow but sure as he guided the young novice through the intricate patterns of knowledge that governed the garden. There were herbs for every ailment that troubled human flesh and spirit. Chamomile for sleepless nights, willow bark for pain, feverfew for the pounding headaches that came with changes in weather, calendula for wounds that were slow to heal. The garden itself told the story of centuries of accumulated wisdom. Each section had been planned with careful thought, taking into account not just the needs of the plants, but the way sun and shadow moved across the enclosed space. Throughout the day and through the seasons, the southern wall caught and held warmth, creating perfect conditions for basil and oregano, for the tender herbs that loved heat and light. The northern sections, cooler and more sheltered, provided ideal homes for mint and parsley, for the plants that preferred gentler conditions. Water flowed through the garden in carefully constructed channels, fed by a spring that emerged from the hillside just above the monastery walls. The brothers of centuries past had understood the precious nature of this gift, building small stone basins where the water could collect and warm in the sun before flowing on to nourish the plants. The sound of this water was constant but never intrusive, a gentle murmur that seemed to encourage peaceful thoughts and steady work. The tools of the garden were simple and well-made, crafted by local artisans who understood that a hoe or spade or pruning knife would be used daily for years, perhaps decades. Brother Marco's hands knew the smooth feel of the wooden handles worn to perfect comfort by countless hours of use. His knife, with its curved blade ideal for harvesting, had been made by the blacksmith in the village. Below, forged from good steel and fitted with a handle of polished olive wood. It hung from his belt in a leather sheath darkened by age and use, as much a part of him as his hands themselves. The monastery supported itself through various enterprises, the copying of manuscripts, the brewing of ale, the production of candles, but the herbal garden provided something perhaps more valuable than gold, the means to heal. Villagers climbed the winding path throughout the year, carrying children with fevers, elderly parents with aching joints, pregnant women seeking herbs to ease their labor. Brother Marco would listen carefully to each complaint, examining the sufferer with gentle hands, then disappear into his workroom to emerge with small cloth packets of dried herbs, or bottles of tinctures, or jars of healing salves. The workroom adjoined the garden, accessible through a low doorway in the monastery's ancient walls. Here, bundles of herbs hung from the rafters like fragrant chandeliers, filling the space with the concentrated essence of the garden's bounty. Shelves lined the walls, holding bottles and jars of every size, each carefully labeled in Brother Marco's precise script. The air was thick with mingled scents, the sharp cleanliness of peppermint, the woody sweetness of rosemary, the bitter complexity of wormwood, the gentle comfort of chamomile. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of use. Here Brother Marco would work in the quiet hours, grinding herbs with pestle and mortar, mixing tinctures in precise proportions, preparing the remedies that would carry the garden's healing power out into the world. The pestle and mortar were old when he arrived at the monastery, carved from a single piece of marble by some long-forgotten craftsman. The stone had been worn smooth by generations of use, and Brother Marco often thought about all the hands that had worked here before his, all the healing that had flowed from this simple room. The seasons governed everything in the garden. Spring brought the delicate work of planting, the careful nurturing of seedlings, the pruning of established plants. Awakening from winter dormancy. Summer meant harvest time for many herbs. The leaves gathered at their peak potency, the flowers picked in the early morning, when the dew still clung to their petals. Autumn was for root harvests, for the gathering of seeds, for the final preparations before winter's rest. And winter? though quieter in the garden itself, was busy with the indoor work of processing the year's harvest, preparing remedies, planning for the coming year. Brother Marco had learned to read the subtle signs that marked each season's approach. The way the light fell differently across the garden walls. The changing behavior of the bees that visited his lavender and thyme. The feel of the morning air, the sound of bird songs, the color of the sky at sunset. All of these things spoke to him in a language learned through decades of patient observation. The garden was never truly empty of life. Even in winter, when the herbs lay dormant beneath occasional dustings of snow, there was always something to observe, something to tend. The perennial plant sent down deep roots, storing energy for spring's renewal. The soil itself rested but never slept, hosting the quiet work of earthworms and countless microscopic beings that transformed decay into new life. At night, when the monastery bells marked the hours of prayer and most of his brother monks slept in their simple cells, Brother Marco would often find himself drawn to the garden. There was something about the darkness that revealed aspects of the plants invisible in daylight. Scents became more intense, more complex. The night-blooming flowers opened their petals to release perfumes designed to attract moths and other nocturnal visitors. The garden breathed differently in darkness, more deeply, more mysteriously. The day began before dawn in the monastery of San Michele, as it had for centuries. The bell in the ancient tower would sound the call to lauds, its bronze voice carrying across the valley to announce the arrival of another day. Brother Marco would wake in his small cell, a simple stone chamber containing a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a table for his books, and a small window that looked out over the garden. Even before fully opening his eyes, he would breathe in the morning air and sense what the day might bring, the promise of rain in the humidity, the hint of changing season in the temperature, the subtle shifts that told him how his plants would be feeling. By the time the community had gathered for morning prayer, sung the ancient psalms, and broken their fast with simple bread and watered wine, the sun would be touching the tops of the garden walls. Brother Marco would slip away from the shared morning meal while his brothers settled into their various daily tasks. Brother Thomas to his manuscripts, Brother Paolo to the brewery, Brother Giuseppe to the beehives that produced honey for the monastery's renowned mead. The early morning hours were precious in the garden. The air was still cool from the night, perfect for work that might become uncomfortable later when the sun climbed higher. Morning was the time for harvesting many herbs, when the dew had evaporated but the heat had not yet driven away the essential oils that made each plant precious. Brother Marco would move slowly through the rows, his trained eye noting which plants were ready, which needed more time, which showed signs of pest or disease that would require attention. He would begin with the chamomile, those cheerful flowers that looked like tiny suns scattered across their feathery green foliage. The flowers were best picked when fully open but not yet beginning to fade, when their apple-like scent was strongest. Brother Marco's fingers moved with practiced precision, selecting only the perfect blooms, leaving the younger buds to mature and the older flowers to set seed for next year's crop. The flowers went into a woven basket lined with clean linen, each layer separated from the next to prevent crushing. From chamomile he would move to the lavender, those purple spikes that never failed to lift his spirits. The lavender grew in a sunny corner near the southern wall, where it caught the morning light and released its fragrance into the warming air. Brother Marco had learned the precise moment to harvest lavender, when the first flowers at the base of each spike were beginning to fade while those at the tip were still in bud. Cut at this moment, the lavender would hold its scent and color through months of storage. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Each plant had its own requirements, its own perfect timing, its own way of communicating its readiness. The lemon balm, with its bright green leaves that smelled of citrus when crushed, was best harvested before it flowered. The sage, gray-green and dusty to the touch, preferred to be cut in mid-morning when the dew was gone but the heat had not yet become intense. The rosemary, woody and resinous, could be harvested almost any time, but Brother Marco had learned that the hours just after sunrise produced the most potent cuttings. As the sun climbed higher, Brother Marco would move to tasks that required less careful timing. Weeding was constant work in any garden, but here it took on an almost ceremonial quality. Each weed was examined before being pulled. Some were useful in their own right, like the dandelions whose bitter leaves could treat disorders of the liver, or the plantain that grew wild in the paths and could heal small wounds when crushed and applied fresh. Brother Marco wasted nothing that might serve a useful purpose. The paths themselves required daily attention. Made of small, rounded stones, carried up from the stream bed, they needed to be kept clear and level. Brother Marco would walk each path slowly, removing fallen leaves, smoothing stones displaced by rain or the passage of feet, ensuring that the garden maintained its sense of order and peace. These paths had been laid out according to principles passed down through generations, wide enough for two people to pass comfortably, curved gently to create interest and surprise, designed to lead the walker naturally from one section of the garden to another. Water was managed with equal care. The spring that fed the garden never failed, but the distribution of its bounty required constant attention. Brother Marco would check each channel, clearing leaves and debris that might block the flow, adjusting small wooden dams that directed water where it was most needed. In dry periods, he would open more channels to ensure that every plant received adequate moisture. In times of heavy rain, he would redirect excess water to prevent flooding and erosion. The morning hours were also time for detailed observation. Brother Marco had learned to read his plants like books written in a language of leaf and stem and flower. A slight yellowing in the lower leaves of the basil might indicate too much water. A wilting in the afternoon heat might suggest the need for more shade or deeper mulching. Holes in leaves could mean insect damage, requiring investigation and possibly the application of one of the gentle remedies he had learned, a spray of soapy water, perhaps, or the introduction of beneficial insects that would control the harmful ones. Each plant had its own character, its own needs, its own gifts to offer. The mint grew with such enthusiasm that it required constant restraint, its runners spreading wherever they touched soil. Brother Marco had learned to grow it in buried pots to contain its exuberance, harvesting the excess to dry for winter teas and digestive remedies. The thyme, by contrast, grew slowly and deliberately, forming dense mats of tiny leaves that released their pungent scent when stepped upon. It served not only as medicine but as a living carpet for some of the garden's pathways. By mid-morning, when the sun was well up and the air beginning to warm, Brother Marco would often be joined by visitors. Word of his skill had spread throughout the region, and people would arrive at all hours seeking help for various ailments. He would listen carefully to each complaint, asking gentle questions, sometimes examining the patient with the calm, careful hands of one who had learned to read the body's signals through touch. A mother might arrive carrying a child with a persistent cough. Brother Marco would brew a gentle tea from coltsfoot and honey, explaining how to prepare it and how often to administer it. He might add a few drops of tincture made from wild cherry bark, sweet and soothing to irritated throats. For the journey home, he would prepare a small packet of herbs that could be steeped in hot water to fill the child's room with healing vapors. An elderly farmer might climb the path, his joints stiff and aching from years of hard work. Brother Marco would prepare a warming salve from wintergreen and rosemary, explaining how to rub it gently into the affected areas. He might also suggest a tea made from willow bark and meadowsweet, nature's own remedies for pain and inflammation. The preparation of these remedies would happen in full view of the patient, Brother Marco explaining each step, demystifying the process, empowering people to care for themselves. A pregnant woman might seek help with the nausea that plagued her mornings. Brother Marco would prepare a careful blend of ginger and mint, explaining that the ginger would settle her stomach while the mint would provide refreshing relief. He would caution her about herbs to avoid during pregnancy, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of herbalist monks who had learned to work in harmony with the body's natural processes rather than against them. The preparation of these remedies was an art that Brother Marco had learned through decades of practice. In his workroom, surrounded by the dried harvest of countless seasons, he would combine herbs in proportions that had been refined through generations of use. The pestle and mortar would grind leaves and roots into powders fine as flour. Glass bottles would be filled with tinctures that captured the essence of plants in alcohol, preserving their healing properties for months or years. Some remedies required cooking. Brother Marco would kindle a small fire in the workroom's hearth, setting iron pots to simmer with carefully measured quantities of herbs and water. The making of a syrup might take hours, the liquid slowly reducing as excess water evaporated, leaving behind a concentrated essence that could be stored and measured in small doses. The scents that filled the workroom during these preparations were intoxicating: the sweet complexity of elderflower syrup, the sharp cleanliness of pine needle extract, the earthy richness of burdock root decoction. Afternoons in the garden had their own rhythm. As the heat intensified, Brother Marco would turn to tasks that could be accomplished in shade or that required less physical exertion. This was the time for processing the morning's harvest, for making decisions about which herbs were ready for drying, which should be used fresh, which might be preserved in oil or vinegar. The drying of herbs was a science in itself. Each plant required specific conditions to retain its potency and color. Some herbs, like basil and parsley, dried best in gentle warmth with good air circulation. Others, like lavender and rosemary, could tolerate more heat without losing their essential qualities. Brother Marco had constructed a series of drying racks in his workroom, positioned to take advantage of different microclimates within the space. Near the small window, where gentle breezes could circulate, he would hang delicate flowers like chamomile and calendula. In the warmest corner, near the hearth, he would place the hardier herbs that benefited from more intense heat. The herbs were bundled according to traditions that went back centuries. Small bunches were tied with strips of clean linen, the knots positioned so that the bundles would hang evenly without crushing the delicate plant material. Each bundle was labeled with the plant's name and the date of harvest, information that would be crucial months later when the time came to use the dried herbs. Brother Marco's handwriting was careful and precise, a skill learned during his early years at the monastery when all the brothers were required to spend time in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts and maintaining the written records that preserved the community's accumulated knowledge. As the herbs dried, the workroom filled with concentrated essences. Walking into the space was like entering the distilled spirit of the garden itself. The air was thick with perfume, each herb contributing its own note to a symphony of scent. Visitors often remarked on the almost overwhelming intensity of the experience. But Brother Marco had grown so accustomed to it that he could distinguish individual plants by scent alone, even when they hung high in the rafters, invisible in the dim light. The late afternoon hours were often spent in contemplative work. Brother Marco would sit at his wooden table, sorting seeds saved from the garden's harvest, planning next year's plantings, updating the careful records he kept of each plant's performance. These records were more than simple notes, they were a dialogue between Brother Marco and the garden, a written conversation spanning decades of seasonal cycles. He would note which varieties of basil had thrived in the previous summer's heat, which chamomile plants had produced the most flowers, which sections of the garden had required more water than usual. This information would guide his decisions in coming seasons, helping him to refine the garden's layout and management. The records also served as insurance against the failures of memory. In his earlier years, Brother Marco had relied on remembering when each herb had been planted, when it had flowered, when it had been harvested. Now, with the wisdom of age, he understood the value of written documentation. The seeds themselves were treasures more valuable than gold. Each tiny packet represented the potential for new life, for continued abundance, for the preservation of varieties that might be lost if not carefully maintained. Brother Marco would clean seeds with meticulous care, removing any chaff or debris. Testing their viability by floating them in water, the good seeds would sink while damaged or hollow ones floated to the surface. Storage of seeds required its own expertise. Each variety had different requirements for moisture, temperature, and air circulation. Brother Marco kept his seeds in small pottery jars, carefully sealed and labeled, arranged on shelves, where he could find them easily when planting season arrived. Some seeds remained viable for only a year, requiring annual harvest and replanting. Others could last for several years if properly stored, providing insurance against crop failures or seasonal disasters. Evening in the garden was perhaps the most magical time of all. As the sun sank toward the western hills and the air began to cool, Brother Marco would make his final rounds of the day. This was when many of the garden's night blooming plants began to stir, when the 4 o'clocks opened their trumpet-shaped flowers, when the evening primrose began to release its lemony fragrance, when the night-blooming cereus, a rare treasure that bloomed only once each year, might choose to reveal its spectacular white flowers. The garden's population changed as daylight faded. Bees returned to their hives, replaced by moths drawn to the pale flowers that opened in darkness. Night flying. Beetles emerged to feed on pollen and nectar. Bats began their nightly hunt for insects, their erratic flight patterns stitching the darkening air. Brother Marco had learned to appreciate these nocturnal visitors, understanding their role in the garden's complex ecosystem. As darkness deepened, Brother Marco would light his simple clay lamp and begin the careful work of evening harvest. Many herbs reached their peak potency in the cool hours after sunset, when the day's heat had not yet driven away their essential oils but the moisture content was low enough to prevent spoilage during drying. This was the best time to harvest oregano for maximum flavor, when the oils were concentrated in the leaves and the plants released their pungent scent at the slightest touch. The night harvest required different techniques than daytime work. Brother Marco moved more slowly, relying on touch and scent as much as sight to identify the plants he sought. His hands had learned to recognize each herb by feel, the fuzzy texture of lamb's ear, the smooth succulence of aloe, the papery quality of dried seed pods ready for collection. The lamplight created a small circle of golden illumination, beyond which the garden dissolved into mysterious shadows, full of rustling leaves and night sounds. Sometimes Brother Marco would encounter other nocturnal workers in the garden. A barn owl might perch silently on the garden wall, hunting for mice that threatened the seed stores. A family of hedgehogs might waddle through the paths, searching for slugs and snails that could damage tender plants. A fox might pause at the garden's edge, visible for just a moment in the lamplight before melting back into the darkness. These encounters felt like benedictions, confirmations that the garden was not separate from the natural world but part of a larger pattern of life that included all creatures. Brother Marco had learned to see his work not as domination of nature, but as collaboration with it, finding ways to work with natural processes rather than against them. The garden was a partnership between human intention and natural abundance, between careful planning and wild spontaneity. The final task of each evening was the watering of plants that preferred moisture. In the cool hours, some herbs, particularly those native to desert climates, absorbed water most efficiently when it was applied after sunset. Brother Marco would move slowly through the garden, carrying a watering can made of hammered copper, its long spout allowing him to direct water precisely where it was needed without wetting the leaves unnecessarily. The sound of water on dry soil was deeply satisfying, a gentle percussion that seemed to awaken the earth itself. Brother Marco could almost hear the plants drinking, feel their gratitude as moisture reached thirsty roots. The scents released by wet soil and refreshed plants created an olfactory symphony that changed throughout the evening, as different plants responded to the gift of water. As the monastery bells marked the progression of the evening hours, vespers at sunset, compline before sleep, Brother Marco would conclude his work in the garden and return to his workroom for the final tasks of the day. By lamplight, he would process the evening's harvest, bundling herbs for drying, chopping fresh leaves for immediate use, preparing tinctures and extracts that would be ready for use in days or weeks to come. The workroom at night was a place of concentrated magic. The small flame of Brother Marco's lamp created dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating bottles and jars that gleamed like jewels in the warm light. The sense of the day's work lingered in the air, the sharp sweetness of freshly cut lavender, the green intensity of crushed mint, the complex perfume of rose petals destined to become healing oil. Brother Marco would work in comfortable silence, his hands following patterns learned through decades of repetition. The rhythm of his work was meditative, almost prayerful, the steady sound of the knife cutting herbs, the gentle grinding of pestle against mortar, the soft splash of tinctures being strained through fine cloth. Each movement was purposeful, connected to all the movements that had come before and all those that would follow. Sometimes, as he worked in the golden circle of lamplight, Brother Marco would reflect on the long chain of knowledge that had brought him to this moment. He thought of Brother Antonio, who had first taught him to distinguish between the many varieties of mint by scent alone. He remembered Brother Giuseppe, who had shown him how to read the subtle signs that indicated when garlic was ready for harvest. He could almost feel the presence of all the herbalist monks who had worked in the same room, processing the same plants, serving the same mission of healing. The knowledge flowed through him like water through the garden's channels, coming from the distant past and moving toward an uncertain future. Brother Marco was simultaneously student and teacher, recipient and guardian of wisdom that belonged not to him alone but to all humanity. Each remedy he prepared, each technique he refined, each seed he saved was a gift to the generations that would come after, just as the knowledge he possessed was a gift from those who had come before. As Brother Marco grew older, passing through his 60th year and into the gentle decline of age, the garden began to teach him its final and perhaps most profound lessons. The cycles that had governed his adult life, the daily round of tending and harvesting, the seasonal progression from planting to fruition to rest, took on new meaning as he felt himself becoming part of the same natural rhythm that governed the plants he had devoted his life to serving. His movements became slower, more deliberate, but also somehow more graceful. Where once he had hurried to complete the day's tasks, now he found himself moving with the measured pace of growing things themselves. His hands, gnarled now like the branches of the ancient olive trees that dotted the hillside below the monastery, had gained a sensitivity that compensated for what they had lost in strength. He could feel the health of a plant through the slightest touch, could sense the moisture content of soil by rubbing it between weathered fingers. The garden, in return, seemed to respond to his gentleness with an abundance that sometimes surprised even him. Plants that had struggled for years would suddenly flourish under his patient care. Seeds that other gardeners had given up for dead would sprout in his hands. It was as if the accumulated wisdom of decades was finally bearing fruit in ways that went beyond technique or knowledge to touch something deeper, something that might have been called communion. Young monks occasionally came to learn from him now, just as he had once learned from Brother Antonio. Brother Marco found himself passing on not just the practical knowledge of herb growing, when to plant, when to harvest, how to prepare remedies, but something more ineffable, a way of being present with growing things that allowed the plants themselves to become teachers. He would lead his students through the garden paths in the early morning, stopping frequently to touch a leaf, to smell a flower, to listen to the almost inaudible sounds of healthy growth. The garden will teach you, he would tell them, if you learn to be still enough to listen. And gradually, season by season, he would watch as the eager young faces learned to soften with patience, as hurried movements slowed to match the rhythm of natural processes, as the students began to understand that successful herb growing was less about mastering techniques than about participating in relationships that were ultimately mysterious and sacred. The records that Brother Marco kept became more philosophical as the years passed. Where once his notes had focused primarily on practical matters, which plants had thrived, which had struggled, what remedies had proven most effective. Now he found himself writing about the deeper patterns he observed, the connections between the health of plants and the health of the soil, between the vigor of the garden and the cycles of moon and season and weather. He began to see the garden not as a collection of individual plants but as a living system, a community in which each member contributed to the welfare of the whole. The deep-rooted comfrey brought nutrients from far below the surface, making them available to shallow-rooted herbs. The nitrogen-fixing legumes enriched the soil for their neighbors. The aromatic herbs repelled harmful insects, while attracting beneficial ones. Everything was connected to everything else in ways that revealed themselves only to patient, sustained observation. The villagers who climbed the path to seek Brother Marco's help began to notice changes in the remedies he prepared. The medicine seemed gentler somehow, but also more effective. Where once he might have prescribed a single herb for a specific ailment, now he would prepare complex formulations that treated not just symptoms but the underlying patterns of imbalance that gave rise to illness. His reputation spread throughout the region and beyond, drawing visitors from distant cities who had heard stories of the monk whose remedies seemed to work with an almost miraculous effectiveness. But Brother Marco remained humble before the mysteries he served. He knew that the true healing came not from his knowledge or skill, but from the plants themselves, from the intricate web of relationships that connected soil and root, and leaf and flower in patterns too complex for human understanding to fully grasp. He was simply the servant of forces far greater than himself, the careful guardian of processes that had been unfolding since long before his birth and would continue long after his death. As winter approached in what would prove to be his final year, Brother Marco spent more and more time in quiet contemplation, seated on a simple wooden bench he had placed in the garden center. From this vantage point, he could see the entire enclosed space, could observe the subtle changes that marked the progression of seasons, could feel himself settling into the same restful dormancy that was claiming the plants around him. The garden in winter was far from lifeless. Beneath the surface, roots continued their slow growth, storing energy for spring's renewal. Seeds lay dormant in the soil, waiting for the return of warmth and light to trigger their miraculous transformation. The perennial herbs had retreated into themselves, but their life force remained strong, ready to burst forth again when conditions were right. Brother Marco felt himself participating in this same rhythm of withdrawal and rest, of gathering strength for whatever transformation lay ahead. On the morning when Brother Marco failed to appear for lauds, the other monks found him in the garden, seated peacefully on his bench, his face turned toward the rising sun. He had died sometime during the night, so quietly that even the plants around him seemed undisturbed, as if his passing had been simply another natural process, like the falling of leaves or the setting of seed. His expression was serene, almost smiling, as if he had finally learned the secret that the garden had been teaching him all along. The funeral was simple, as Brother Marco would have wished. The entire community of the monastery attended, along with dozens of villagers whose lives had been touched by his gentle healing. They buried him in the small cemetery behind the monastery church, not far from the garden where he had spent the best years of his life. The grave marker was a plain stone cross, bearing only his name and the dates of his birth and death, but the villagers planted herbs around the grave, lavender and rosemary, thyme and sage, so that his resting place would always be surrounded by the fragrances he had loved. In the months that followed, the garden seemed to flourish with unusual abundance, as if Brother Marco's presence had somehow become part of the soil itself. The young monk who took over his duties, Brother Francesco, who had been one of his most devoted students, found that plants grew with unexpected vigor, that remedies prepared according to Brother Marco's recipes worked with unusual effectiveness, that the garden itself seemed to be offering guidance to those willing to listen. Visitors to the monastery often remarked on the extraordinary peace that pervaded the herb garden. Even those with no particular interest in plants would find themselves lingering on the gravel paths, breathing in the mingled fragrances, feeling their spirits lifted by something indefinable but unmistakable. Children would become calm and quiet in the garden's presence. Troubled adults would find their worries easing, their perspectives shifting toward hope and healing. The garden had become more than a source of medicinal plants, it had become a sanctuary, a place where the barriers between human consciousness and the deeper wisdom of the natural world seemed to dissolve. People would come, seeking physical healing, and discover that their souls, too, had been touched by something restorative and sacred. The herbs continued to work their chemical magic in tinctures and teas and salves, but they also worked a more subtle magic. Simply by being present, by offering their beauty and fragrance and quiet vitality to all who approached them with respect and openness. Years passed, then decades. The monastery endured through periods of political upheaval and social change, through wars and plagues and natural disasters, through the slow transformation of the medieval world into something more modern and complex. But the herb garden remained essentially unchanged, a pocket of ancient wisdom preserved within walls of honey-colored stone, tended by a succession of patient monks who learned to listen to what the plants themselves had to teach. The knowledge that Brother Marco had embodied, the deep understanding of how to work in harmony with natural processes, how to serve the healing power inherent in growing things, continued to flow like water from a hidden spring. Each gardener who took responsibility for the herbs learned not only techniques and recipes but something more precious, a way of being in the world that recognized the sacred presence in all life, the connections that bind all beings in a web of mutual dependence and care. The garden became a repository not just of plants and knowledge but of a particular vision of human possibility. Here, within these ancient walls, people could glimpse what life might be like if lived in conscious partnership with the natural world. They could experience the peace that comes from aligning human activity with natural rhythms, the satisfaction of work that serves life rather than exploiting it, the deep contentment that arises from participating in processes larger and more enduring than individual human existence. As the modern world grew increasingly complex and hurried, increasingly separated from the natural sources of life and health, the monastery garden offered a counterpoint, a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be recovered. The herbs continued to grow season after season, offering their healing gifts to all who sought them out. The paths continued to invite contemplative walking. The walls continued to create a space where time moved at the pace of growing things, where the urgent gave way to the important, where the noise of the world faded into the gentle symphony of wind and water and rustling leaves. The garden had become eternal in the way that all truly sacred spaces are eternal. Not because they exist outside of time, but because they embody principles and relationships that transcend the particular historical moments in which they manifest. The love that Brother Marco had brought to his work, the patience he had learned from years of tending growing things, the wisdom he had gained from participating in the ancient dialogue between human intention and natural abundance, all of this remained present in the garden, available to anyone who approached it with sufficient openness and reverence. And so the garden continued its quiet work of healing, season after season, year after year, offering its gifts to a world that often seemed to have forgotten the simple truths that growing things can teach. The herbs reached toward the light, sent roots deep into the dark soil, flowered and set seed and died and were reborn, participating in the great dance of life that connects all beings in patterns of mutual care and mutual dependence. In the evening hours, when the monastery bells marked the end of another day, when the last visitors had departed and the garden settled into the peaceful quiet of approaching night, the spirit of Brother Marco seemed to move along the familiar paths, checking on plants that had been his companions, breathing in the fragrances that had filled his days with purpose and joy. The garden remembered him, held his presence in the very soil where his love had taken root and flourished, where his patient care had created something beautiful and healing and enduring. The night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the darkness. The nocturnal insects began their quiet work of pollination. The garden breathed with the slow, deep rhythm of growing things, offering its silent blessing to a world in need of healing, in need of the peace that comes from remembering our place in the larger community of life. And now, as the stars trace their ancient paths above, may you find rest beside the stories of quiet lives long past. May you feel the peace that comes from remembering that we too are part of the great garden of existence, rooted in the same soil, reaching toward the same light, participating in the same eternal dance of growth and rest and renewal that connects all living things in the sacred web of being.